Hello, I'm a student studying for the MCAT, and I know how overwhelming the nervous system can seem at first. There's a lot of things to know, like ions, voltages, and stuff like that. So I took pages of my notes and turned them into a simple one page about the nervous system, and today I'll be walking you through it from the top to the bottom. By the end of this, hopefully you will understand how your brain sends a signal, how fast it travels, and even how antidepressants tie into all of this. If you're studying, you might find this useful. I'm also a visual learner, so I like to see diagrams, and I like to see how things are related to each other, and you might see, if that's the case for you, you might find it useful. So let's start. A neuron is essentially, well, first let's start talking about the nervous system. What is a nervous system? It's basically how your brain sends signals, right? And the basic building block of the nervous system is a neuron. A neuron is a special type of cell that can send and receive messages. So it can transmit and translate electrical impulses into chemical signals throughout your body. It's basically an electrical messenger. Everything your body does, moving your hand, breathing, thinking, watching this, depends on these neurons firing these electrical signals over and over again. So the neuron has three main parts that I drew over here. So it has these dendrites. These are branch-like extensions that receive information from other neurons. It also has a cell body, which is a soma. It also has a nucleus, of course. And essentially, the cell body is the control center that processes signals and keeps the neuron alive. So it also has an axon, this long fiber that carries electrical messages away from the cell body toward other cells. At the end of the axon are axon terminals, which release chemicals called neurotransmitters to send messages to the next cell. Some axons are wrapped in a myelin sheath, as you can see here. A fatty layer that insulates the neuron and makes the signal travel much faster. So let's review that. So essentially the signal comes in through the dendrites, then it moves to the cell body, then it moves to the axon hillock and jumps from one node of RON-VA to another, and then it gets to the axon terminals. So the question here is, why does the signal travel fast and how does it do that? The nervous system controls things that happen instantly, like pulling your hand off of a hot stove. Or adjusting your balance when you start to fall. Basically helps you survive, right? To make that possible, the myelin that we talked about earlier, it acts like a coating around the electrical wires that prevents the signal from leaking out. Instead of traveling smoothly down the axon, the impulse jumps between gaps in the myelin called, as we said, nodes of RON-VA. This jumping, we call it saltatory conduction. And it basically makes the signal travel hundreds, thousands times faster, keeping your brain and your body in perfect sync and helping you survive, like I said. So, as you know, nerves are made up of multiple neurons that are bundled together. And the nervous system has two main divisions. The central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord, and this is the command center that processes information and decides how to respond. The peripheral nervous system, right here, are basically all of the nerves that branch out from the brain and spinal cord to the rest of the body. This system carries information to and from the central nervous system. We also have cells that you should know. So there are different cell types in the central nervous system. As you can see, I drew them out for you here. I personally wanted to see how these cells look like, along with what they do. So in the central nervous system, you have support cells like astrocytes. They're right here. They maintain the environment around the neuron, essentially. Oligodendrocytes are right here. They create the myelin sheath that we talked about around the axons in the brain and the spinal cord. We also have ependymal cells. They line the ventricles of the central nervous system to help circulate cerebrospinal fluid. In the peripheral nervous system, you have Schwann cells. They look like this, and satellite cells that look like this. Schwann cells, they make the myelin for the peripheral nerves, so they're similar to oligodendrocytes, right? And satellite cells, they protect and support nerve cell bodies. So they're similar to astrocytes. So essentially, the peripheral nervous system, you should know that it splits into two systems, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system controls voluntary movements like walking or talking, and it sends signals from the central nervous system to your skeletal muscles. So these movements are under our control, right? However, the autonomic nervous system controls involuntary actions, things you don't consciously think about, like, for example, your heart rate, your breathing, your digestion, things like that. So the autonomic nervous system has two sides that balance each other. The sympathetic, or the fight or flight system, which basically helps speed up your heart, widens your airways, and sends blood to your muscles so you can react really fast. And also the parasympathetic nervous system, which handles rest and digest. It slows your heart rate, increases digestion, helps your body relax and recover. These are like they're like a seesaw. When one is active, the other quiets down. Things like that. They help balance each other. So now, how does your information actually move? So essentially, afferent neurons, they carry sensory signals to the brain and spinal cord. For example, feeling heat on your skin. The efferent neurons, they carry motor signals from the brain to your body. So like motor info, like moving your hand away. In between these are interneurons, which live in the spinal cord and brain and help connect sensory input to motor input. They're also responsible for reflex arcs, essentially telling your brain when you touch a hot stove, hey, my body did this, and also telling your muscles, your arm, to move your hand away from the hot stove, okay? So now we've been talking about the signal sending, right? So essentially, the transmission of the signal is called an action potential. An action potential is the brief electrical signal a neuron uses to send information down its axon. This is an all or nothing message that, like I said, relays that electrical impulse to the next cell. So at rest, the neuron has a resting potential at about negative 70 millivolts, meaning the inside of the cell is negative compared to the outside. When the neuron gets stimulated enough and the inside reaches about negative 55 or negative 50, which is the threshold, sodium channels open, letting sodium ions rush in. The inside, as you can see here, becomes positive. That's depolarization. Then potassium channels open, and sodium channels close, and potassium ions flow out, returning the cell to negative voltage, which is repolarization. Soon it dips below the resting for a moment because of something called hyperpolarization. That's because potassium channels are slower to close. So too much potassium sort of gets out, and we see that our voltage is way lower than our resting that we started with. So eventually what happens is that the sodium potassium ATPase pump, it activates and it restores the membrane potential. And this entire up and down change is one action potential, okay? So this is the spike that on the graph that you see like in every textbook. This graph helps you understand because it shows you that each stage of this process, resting, depolarization, repolarization, returning to rest, and helps you see how the charge inside the neuron changes and why the signal only moves in one direction, and how the neuron resets itself to fire again. So what exactly are we talking about when we say voltage in a neuron? Voltage essentially just means the electrical charge difference between the inside and the outside of the neuron. At rest, the inside is more negative because more positive ions like sodium are outside than inside. So when sodium rushes in, the inside becomes more positive. That's what creates the voltage change we see in the graph. So when the action potential reaches the end of the axon terminal, it opens the voltage-gated calcium channels. So calcium channels, they flow into the neuron and that triggers the vesicles full of neurotransmitters to fuse with the membrane and release their contents to the synaptic cleft, this tiny gap between neurons. Those neurotransmitters, they then bind to the next neuron and can either start another signal or inhibit another signal. So after the neurotransmitter does its job, the signal must be stopped. Otherwise, the neurons will fire endlessly. There are three main ways that this happens: reuptake, enzymatic breakdown, and diffusion. So reuptake is when the neurotransmitter is essentially absorbed back into the neuron that released it. Enzymatic breakdown is when the enzymes destroy it. And diffusion is when it simply drifts away from the synapse. Okay, now let's talk about antidepressants. So people with depression are often prescribed selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Normally, serotonin, a neurotransmitter linked to mood, is released into the synapse, does its job, and then gets reabsorbed by uptake. So selective serotonin uptake inhibitors, they block that reuptake, meaning more serotonin stays in the synapse longer. And this actually keeps the mood-related signals active for a longer time, helping improve symptoms of depression. So this is an example of a mechanism that either continues or stops neurotransmitter firing. So neurons are constantly receiving thousands of small signals. You may have heard of things like temporal summation and spatial summation. These are also important to note. Temporal summation essentially happens when signals arrive quickly. Okay, so temporal summation are when signals arrive quickly, one after another, before the previous one fades. And then spatial summation happens when signals from different neurons arrive at the same time, and if all those signals together reach the threshold, the neuron fires another action potential. This is essentially how the brain decides which inputs are important enough to act on. So let's put it all together. Your central nervous system processes information. The peripheral nervous system carries it back and forth. Sensory nerves bring in data, and interneurons interpret it, and then motor neurons, they send out responses inside each neuron. Action potentials, they race down the axon, jumping between nodes of RON VA, right? And essentially, they jump between nodes thanks to the myelin. At the end, the calcium triggers neurotransmitters to cross the synapse, and other neurons decide whether to fire based on temporal and spatial summation. So together, these signals, they create your thoughts, feelings, reflexes, and actions that all happen in your body in seconds. And that is a nervous system, from the structure of a single neuron to how your entire body communicates. If you found this helpful, make sure you let me know, and hopefully it helps in your studying. Thank you so much.